I knew I was in trouble the moment I heard that icy, razor-edged tone drifting over the hydrangea bushes. I trust you're not planning anything unacceptable on this property, are you? That was Margaret's way of welcoming me to the first day of my new life in Willow Creek Estates. Standing on my freshly swept driveway, sweat beading on my forehead, I felt her words slice through my excitement like a pair of rogue shears. I had moved into this immaculate suburban neighborhood earlier in the year to start a new chapter with my fiancé, Daniel. It was supposed to be a low-stress transition, downsizing from my big, lonely condo in the city and embracing the quiet rhythms of a friendly community. Only no one had warned me about Willow Creek Estate's self-appointed queen. Margaret wasn't just an ordinary neighbor. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, and she ruled the realm with a force that would make medieval kings blush. I turned around, mustering a polite smile. I had learned from experience that the slightest sign of defiance could trigger one of her crusades. Nothing unacceptable, Margaret. Just preparing for my big day. Our wedding's in a few months, I said, gesturing toward the modest but lovingly chosen decorations. We plan to host a small reception in the backyard. She sniffed the air like a bloodhound. I heard it's going to be close to 60 people. That's hardly small. Her gaze fixed on the flower arrangements I'd set along the walkway. And are those real lilies? Our guidelines specify only native greenery in front yards. My face grew hot. They're potted for now. I'm moving them to the backyard tomorrow, I said, almost apologetically. Maybe it was foolish of me, but I genuinely hoped we could find a friendly relationship, or at least a détente. It was my wedding, after all. Who wanted drama overshadowing such a precious milestone? Margaret brushed away my explanation with a wave of her manicured fingers. Just make sure you read the bylaws, she said, her voice steely yet sweet. I'd hate to report you for improper landscaping, but rules are rules. That was how it started, my first real conversation with Margaret, if you could call it that. Over the next few weeks, as Daniel and I delved into finalizing wedding invitations and meeting with the caterer, we were greeted by subtle reminders of her presence. Mysterious letters would appear in our mailbox, typed in formal language and signed by the HOA. Items frowned upon included overly tall floral arrangements, apparently a hazard to local pollinators, non-regulation lighting, my fiancé's string lights for romantic ambience, and excessive foot traffic, the number of guests we had invited to the ceremony. I tried to shrug it off. After all, a little friction with the HOA was par for the course in many suburbs, or so I'd heard from friends. But Margaret was next level. One day, I found her measuring the distance between my newly installed stepping stones and the sidewalk. Another time, she showed up unannounced to inspect the yard where the ceremony would take place. She snapped photos of the rose trellis, counted the chairs, and had the audacity to question my color scheme. She claimed it was too flashy for the neighborhood aesthetic, even though it was tasteful and understated. It was exasperating, but I had to remind myself, I wasn't just planning a party. I was planning a union, one that would hopefully last a lifetime. Our family and friends were traveling from all over. My mother, in her 80s, was flying in from Texas. Daniel's son and daughter-in-law were driving from 3 states away. Everyone was thrilled to gather for what we'd assured them would be a relaxed, fun affair in our own backyard. Privately, I worried that Margaret would ruin everything. Yet, a tiny part of me thought maybe she'd calm down once she realized we weren't going to throw some rowdy rager. But no such luck. Her notes became more frequent, more formal, and more threatening. We have reason to believe your intended event may violate multiple sections of the HOA covenants. Fines will be levied if immediate compliance is not achieved. Daniel was equally frustrated, but he tried to remain a voice of reason. We just need to follow their guidelines, he reminded me one evening as we stuffed invitations into envelopes. Let's see what they want. Maybe we can compromise. I wanted to believe it was that simple, but I also knew Margaret wasn't a woman content to compromise. I caught glimpses of her when she thought no one was looking, her spine rigid, lips pursed, scanning the neighborhood for minor infractions like a hawk. She radiated authority, but there was something else lurking under that veneer, an emptiness, perhaps, or a longing for significance beyond the day-to-day. The first real blow arrived a month before the wedding in the form of a certified letter from the HOA board. Inside was an exhaustive list of demands, culminating in a threat to revoke my privileges to host the event if I didn't comply with an impossible schedule of changes. Limit the guest count to 30, remove non-native flowers, and adhere to an 8 p.m. noise curfew. I sat on my porch swing and stared at the letter, my stomach twisting in knots. This was no trivial threat. The board had teeth, Margaret's teeth, and the power to levy serious penalties, even block the wedding on private property thanks to archaic local statutes. That night, sleep was elusive. I pictured my family being turned away at the gates on my wedding day, or worse, the police arriving mid-ceremony to shut us down. It seemed unthinkable, but then again, we'd chosen a place where the HOA was apparently run like a feudal kingdom by one single-minded regent. And that's how the slow brewing storm over my wedding began, a fraught series of encounters that would soon escalate into outright sabotage and heartbreak. The meeting. I decided to schedule a meeting with Margaret in hopes of cutting through the officious formalities. Maybe speaking neighbor to neighbor, woman to woman, would help. I was sitting at my dining room table, phone in hand, scribbling down bullet points. "Hi, Margaret," I said cheerily when she answered. "Do you have a moment to talk about the upcoming wedding? Maybe in person?" A beat of silence. "Well," she said, her tone clipped, "I suppose I can spare a few minutes if it's not too disruptive." We agreed to meet at her place that weekend. Margaret's house loomed large at the end of the cul-de-sac, always immaculate, from the pot of pristine white orchids on her front porch to the symmetrical topiaries that bordered her walkway. As I stepped onto the porch, I couldn't help but notice how not a single leaf or stray petal marred the property. Everything was in its place, no doubt curated to perfection. She met me at the door with a tight-lipped smile. "Come in," she said, gesturing toward the living room. The space looked like a page from a high-end interior design magazine. No personal photos, no comfortable clutter, just pristine white furniture and glass coffee tables. It felt more like a museum than a home. I cleared my throat. "Margaret, I appreciate you seeing me. I want to resolve any issues before the wedding. Honestly, we're not trying to break any rules. We just want a simple backyard celebration." She sat upright in a beige armchair that looked like it had never been sat in before. "The guidelines exist for a reason," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "Once you allow even a small slip, like, say, a large gathering, others will think they can do the same. Our property values are at stake." I tried to remain patient. "I understand property values are crucial, but we'll be responsible. We're bringing in a caterer, we've arranged for portable restrooms to keep guests from traipsing in and out, and the decorations will be tasteful." "Truly," she eyed me critically. "That's what everyone says until the yard is trampled and the streets are lined with cars. You'll have to arrange off-site parking. The association does not allow vehicles to block roads. We have guidelines for noise levels as well. Live music is absolutely prohibited after 8 p.m. and no amplified instruments at all." I swallowed hard. We had planned for a small string trio to play into the early evening. "We can adjust the schedule," I said carefully. "So the music ends by 8. That's not a problem." She tapped a pen against her palm. "And the flowers. There will be no confetti or rose petals strewn about. Correct? Our birds could choke on them." Rose petals could cause birds to choke? That was a new one. My mother always said you can't argue with crazy, but I tried. "We'll keep it minimal," I promised, feeling small and constrained. "Just enough for ambience." Margaret nodded, as if magnanimously granting me a tiny grace. "I suppose we can work with that. But we'll need a full schedule of the day's events, start time, end time, number of guests, vendor arrivals, submitted in writing to the HOA at least 2 weeks in advance." "Fine," I said, hopeful that I was finally making progress. "I'll send that over." Little did I know, that meeting was simply part of Margaret's pattern. She seemed cooperative one moment, only to tighten the screws further behind the scenes. The escalation. 2 days later, a revised letter arrived, citing additional requirements, a mandatory safety inspection, whatever that meant, daily updates about any changes, and a yard inspection the day before the wedding. Each requirement came with the threat of fines or further consequences if not met. I tried to keep calm as I read the letter out loud to Daniel, my voice quivering with frustration. What does she expect? That we're going to build a roller coaster in the backyard? It's just a wedding. Daniel placed a soothing hand on my shoulder. "Let's try to comply as much as we can. We don't want to give her a legitimate reason to block the ceremony." That logic made sense, So we stayed up late drafting a thorough schedule, making sure every detail was accounted for. Arrival time for the florist, 9 a.m., set up for the caterer, noon, ceremony start time, for p.m. We typed it, printed it, and delivered it to Margaret's mailbox. For a while, it seemed that might satisfy her demands. But a week later, I glanced out the window to see Margaret pacing the perimeter of our backyard, clipboard in hand. I rushed outside, heart pounding with annoyance. "Margaret, what on earth are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my tone civil. She turned on her heel, expression smug. "Inspecting. We have to ensure your yard meets landscaping code. I see at least 5 potential violations already: branch overhang, possible sprinkler misalignment, fence discoloration." Her voice trailed off as she scribbled furiously. I stared at her, incredulous. "Isn't there a grace period before you start citing new homeowners? These issues existed before I moved in." She arched an eyebrow. "It's your property now." This was a whole new level of intimidation, but I was determined not to engage in a screaming match. Instead, I took a deep breath and simply said, "Let me know what you find, Margaret," before turning away. That night, I reread the HOA bylaws, searching for some loophole or protective clause. It became clear Margaret was either operating on her own extreme interpretations or had the board in her back pocket. The more I read, the more hopeless it felt, from external paint colors to fence heights to permissible hours for gatherings. Every detail was spelled out in black and white, and all of it was open to enforcement at the discretion of the HOA. As Daniel and I inched closer to the wedding date, we joked darkly about wearing camouflage and sneaking the guests in under cover of darkness. But beneath that grim humor, a sense of dread curled in my gut. A small voice in my head whispered, "She's not done with you." Not by a long shot. And that nagging fear was, unfortunately, spot on. The final straw. Despite Margaret's intrusive inspections and endless demands, we pressed forward with wedding preparations. I busied myself with finalizing the menu, wanting to include a few nods to Daniel's Midwestern roots, as well as my own Southern heritage. Our caterer, a local favorite named Bethany, was excited to prepare a special dessert table featuring mini pecan pies and homemade fudge. Meanwhile, Daniel hired a friend to serve as our DJ for after-dinner dancing, albeit with the strict promise that the music would be turned off by 8 p.m. Amid the hustle, life threw another curveball. My mother's health took a sudden dip, prompting me to fly out to Texas for a few days to help her get settled with new medication. While I was gone, I asked Daniel to keep an eye on the house and ensure Margaret didn't cross any more lines. But the day I returned, I found him sitting on our front step, shoulders slumped, an official-looking envelope in his hand. "You're not going to like this," he said, offering it to me. I opened the envelope, my heart pounding. It was yet another letter from the HOA, or, more specifically, from Margaret. "It has come to our attention that you have scheduled an unapproved vendor, DJ, and intend to violate the decibel limit for this neighborhood. Effective immediately, all musical performances must be canceled and replaced with HOA-approved alternatives. Any event found in violation will be shut down by authorities." I let out a bitter laugh, but there was no real humor in it. "So she's policing music style now?" Daniel sighed. I tried to talk to her. "She claims the decibel limit in the neighborhood is only for small acoustic sets. The bylaws are vague, but she's reading it in a way that forbids any amplified sound." I rubbed my temples, exhausted. "We have a grand total of 60 guests. This is not a rock concert." And we agreed to stop the music at 8 o'clock. He gave a helpless shrug. "Margaret doesn't care. She threatened to fine us $200 for every half hour we play music. And she said the county noise ordinance might allow her to call the police if we exceed the decibel limit." At that moment, I wanted to scream, or cry, or both. But before I could even process what to do next, my phone buzzed in my purse. It was my mother, calling to let me know her flight details. She'd arrived 3 days before the wedding, excited to see the final touches. I forced a bright tone into my voice and assured her everything would be lovely. I promised I'd pick her up from the airport and she'd get to rest before the big day. As I ended the call, I felt tears burning behind my eyes. I couldn't let my mother see me crumble. The wedding day. The morning of my wedding day dawned bright and clear, the early sunlight dancing across my manicured lawn. I stood at the window, wearing a satin robe and clutching a cup of tea. I wanted to savor this day, to soak up every detail in memory. My mother was in the guest room down the hall, her soft hum drifting under the door as she prepared. Soon, friends and family would arrive for the ceremony, and I yearned for those hours of warmth and celebration to begin. But then the phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my heart hammering as I checked the caller ID. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The phone beeped with a new message, and when I played it back, my stomach sank. Good morning. This is Officer Burrows of the City Police. We've received a formal request to monitor an event at your residence for potential code violations. We'd like to speak with you as soon as possible. I slapped a hand over my mouth, stifling a scream of frustration. On my wedding day? Where did Margaret find the audacity to call the police in advance? And how is that even allowed? Daniel tried to calm me. Let's not panic. Maybe the officer just wants to confirm there's no real problem. It might not be as bad as it sounds. His words were reasonable, but I heard the worry in his voice. We decided to press on. At noon, the florist arrived, carefully placing hydrangeas and lilies along the backyard trellis. Fortunately, all native or potted to satisfy the HOA's demands. The caterer quietly set up a buffet table under a modest tent. My mother hovered, insisting on folding the napkins herself to keep her nerves at bay. By 3 p.m., guests began to trickle in, smiling and chatty. I slipped into my lace wedding gown, my breath quivering with excitement. For a moment, it was perfect, the birds chirping, the gentle breeze, the glint in Daniel's eye when he first saw me walk toward him. I felt a warm flood of love for this man who had stood by me through so much adversity, even this absurd battle with our neighbor. Then, just as the officiant took her place at the small altar, I heard the rumble of an engine. A police cruiser appeared at the curb, lights flashing but no siren. A balding officer stepped out and approached, looking apologetic. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace as he spotted me in my wedding dress. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm just here to confirm everything's up to code. My voice wobbled as I tried to remain composed. I understand. Please do what you must. This is a private event, though. We're about to start the ceremony. He nodded, stepping into the backyard with me. He gave the lawn a cursory glance, checked the placement of the chairs, and asked about any amplified music. Daniel explained the new plan. We'd have a short trio playing acoustic music and then move the reception dancing to a nearby hall. All right, the officer said gently. I'll be on my way. I don't see any violation here. I opened my mouth to thank him, but a piercing, furious voice sliced through the cordiality. Officer, over here. Margaret came rushing around the side of the house, short heels pounding on the grass. She wore a crisp pink suit, as if she were officiating a business meeting, not attending a wedding. They promised no amplified sound, yet there are microphones for the officiant. That's a direct violation of HOA code. Heads turned. My mother's eyes went wide. The guests exchanged stunned glances. Margaret's shrill voice rose above our quiet shock. This is exactly what I was afraid of. The association does not permit. The officer held up a hand, looking tired already. Ma'am, the microphone here is barely above speaking level. There's no breach of any city ordinance. Margaret's face twisted with indignation. But the HOA rules. This is a blatant disregard for. I felt tears in my eyes. Was this truly happening? My wedding guests were witnessing a meltdown that should have been reserved for daytime reality TV. I stepped forward, my voice trembling. Margaret, please. We followed every rule you set. We moved the dancing. We used only potted plants. We even arranged off-site parking. Don't you raise your voice at me, young lady. She snapped. You're the one who. That's enough. My mother's voice rang out, surprising me. She moved with an elegant authority, stepping between Margaret and me. At 83, my mother was no pushover. She glared at Margaret through narrowed eyes. I've watched you harass my daughter for months now. Have you no decency? This is her wedding day. Margaret blinked, momentarily taken aback by my mother's stern tone. But just as quickly, she recovered, pointing an accusatory finger. Your daughter broke the HOA rules. I'm only doing my duty to uphold property standards. I could see the ceremony unraveling with every word. Guests shifted uncomfortably. The officiant stood there, holding her script, unsure whether to proceed. My mother's chest heaved with contained fury. I've seen bullies like you in my day. Let me tell you something. You may fool these neighbors, but you don't fool me. A hush fell over the crowd. Margaret's lips parted, her face going from pink to red. "How dare you?" "Officer," my mother demanded, turning away from Margaret. "Are they violating any state or local laws?" The officer shook his head. "No, ma'am. Not as far as I can see." My mother looked pointedly at Margaret, who seemed speechless for once. Then she nodded to the officiant. "Please, dear, continue." And somehow, we did. The ceremony resumed, though the mood was irreparably shaken. Margaret stomped off to the side, arms crossed, glaring at us through narrowed eyes like a toad ready to pounce. I tried to focus on Daniel, on the words we exchanged, our vows to stand by each other in sickness and in health, through thick and thin. I forced a smile, my voice quavering as I said, "I do." Moments later, we sealed our union with a kiss. The small cluster of guests clapped softly, subdued by the drama that had just unfolded. Margaret lingered like a storm cloud in the corner of my eye, and that's when I realized she wasn't finished. As we turned to greet our guests, confetti, biodegradable, mind you, fluttered into the air. Margaret's shriek tore through the yard. "That's littering. Officer, arrest them." She lunged toward the unsuspecting officer, who stood with arms folded, thoroughly unimpressed. He shook his head and muttered something along the lines of "This is ridiculous," before walking away. Margaret stomped her foot like a tantrum-throwing child. And in that odd moment, I felt a surge of pity for her. What sad existence drove her to these lengths on someone else's wedding day? But the damage was done. My wedding was overshadowed by her theatrics. My dress felt heavy with frustration, my eyes brimming with disappointed tears. We took a few rushed photos, but my grin was forced, the joy drained by a neighbor who decided that her warped sense of control mattered more than decency. And though we had the ceremony, it was not the kind of memory I dreamed about. In the end, we hurried the guests off to the church hall for dinner and dancing. At least there, we found some laughter as the music played under fluorescent lights. Later that night, Daniel and I collapsed in bed, still half-dressed in our wedding attire, battered from the emotional onslaught. Yes, we were married. Yes, we'd exchanged vows. But in a sense, Margaret had destroyed the idyllic wedding I'd always imagined. She'd stripped away the magic and turned it into a confrontation under a bright midday sun. As I closed my eyes, I resolved one thing. In time, we'd find a new neighborhood, one far away from Margaret's petty tyranny. For now, though, we had each other. And that was what truly mattered. Even a rampaging HOA tyrant couldn't take that away from us. Epilogue. In the months that followed, Daniel and I settled into married life, but the shadow of Margaret's interference lingered. We began house hunting in earnest, searching for a community where rules served the people, not the other way around. As for Margaret, she remained the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates, her reign unchallenged by the neighbors who feared her wrath. But as we packed our belongings and prepared to leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. We had weathered her storm, and in doing so, we had forged a bond stronger than any HOA rule. Our love, tested by adversity, had emerged unscathed, and that, I realized, was the true victory. Certainly. Below is part 2 of the story, continuing the narrative and expanding on the aftermath of the wedding, the couple's decision to move, and their new life in a different neighborhood. This part delves deeper into their struggles, their growth as a couple, and how they ultimately find peace away from Margaret's tyranny. The story is written in natural, standard American English, with a focus on character development and emotional depth. Part 2, a fresh start. The aftermath. The weeks following the wedding were a blur of mixed emotions. Daniel and I were officially married, but the joy of our union was tinged with the bitterness of Margaret's interference. The photos from our wedding day told a story of forced smiles and uneasy glances, a stark contrast to the idyllic celebration we had envisioned. Every time I looked at them, I felt a pang of regret, not for marrying Daniel, but for allowing Margaret to cast such a long shadow over our special day. Margaret, true to form, didn't let up. Even after the wedding, she continued to patrol the neighborhood like a hawk, her clipboard always at the ready. She left passive-aggressive notes in our mailbox, citing minor infractions like a misplaced trash can or a garden hose left coiled on the wrong side of the house. It was as if she couldn't stand the idea of us living peacefully, even after she had already disrupted our wedding. One evening, as Daniel and I sat on the porch sipping tea, I finally voiced what we had both been thinking. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and resignation. Margaret will never stop. She'll make our lives miserable for as long as we live in this neighborhood. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. I've been thinking the same thing. But where do we go? And how do we even start over? It was a daunting question. We had moved to Willow Creek Estates with such high hopes, envisioning a quiet, friendly community where we could build our life together. Now, the thought of uprooting ourselves again felt overwhelming. But the alternative, living under Margaret's constant scrutiny, was even worse. The search for a new home. We began our search for a new home in earnest, scouring real estate listings and visiting open houses on weekends. This time, we were determined to find a neighborhood without an overbearing HOA, or at least one that wasn't run like a dictatorship. We wanted a place where we could breathe freely, where our lives wouldn't be dictated by someone else's arbitrary rules. After weeks of searching, we found a charming house in a small, unincorporated community called Maplewood Hills. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to Willow Creek Estates. The houses were older, with unique architectural styles, and the yards were filled with wildflowers, vegetable gardens, and even the occasional chicken coop. There was no HOA here, just a loose association of neighbors who looked out for one another without imposing strict regulations. The first time we visited the house, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The property was surrounded by tall trees, offering privacy and a sense of seclusion. The backyard was spacious, with a wooden deck perfect for summer barbecues and a small pond that reflected the sunlight like a mirror. It was the kind of place where we could imagine raising a family, hosting friends, and living without fear of constant scrutiny. We could be happy here, I said to Daniel as we stood in the backyard, the sound of birdsong filling the air. He nodded, a smile spreading across his face. Yeah, this feels like home. The move itself was chaotic, as moves often are. We packed up our belongings, said goodbye to the house in Willow Creek Estates, and left without looking back. As we drove away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Margaret had tried to control every aspect of our lives, but in the end, she couldn't stop us from choosing our own path. Our new neighbors in Maplewood Hills welcomed us with open arms. On our first day, a woman named Clara from across the street brought over a basket of homemade muffins and a handwritten note with her phone number. If you need anything, just holler, she said with a warm smile. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to us after the cold reception we had experienced in Willow Creek Estates. As we settled into our new home, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could relax without worrying about breaking some obscure rule or incurring Margaret's wrath. Daniel and I spent our evenings unpacking boxes, painting walls, and planning how we would decorate the house. It was a fresh start, and we were determined to make the most of it. Margaret's last stand. But Margaret wasn't ready to let us go so easily. A few weeks after we moved, I received a letter in the mail, typed on the same formal stationery as her previous missives. My heart sank as I opened it, fearing she had found some way to extend her reach into our new lives. The letter was a thinly veiled threat. Margaret claimed that we had left Willow Creek Estates without properly notifying the HOA and that we owed fines for various violations she had documented during our time there. She even threatened to take legal action if we didn't comply. I showed the letter to Daniel, my hands shaking with anger. Can she even do this? I asked. He read through the letter, his brow furrowed. I don't think so. We're not part of that HOA anymore. She's just trying to intimidate us. We decided to consult a lawyer, just to be safe. The lawyer assured us that Margaret had no legal grounds to pursue us, especially since we no longer lived in the neighborhood. She's bluffing, the lawyer said. Ignore her. If she tries anything, we'll handle it. With that reassurance, we put the letter out of our minds and focused on building our new life. But Margaret's attempt to control us from afar was a stark reminder of how toxic her influence had been. It also made me realize how much we had grown as a couple. We had faced her together, and now we were moving forward, stronger than ever. A new chapter. As the months passed, Daniel and I settled into our new routine. We planted a garden in the backyard, joined a local book club, and even adopted a rescue dog named Max. Life in Maplewood Hills was everything we had hoped for. Peaceful, welcoming, and free from the constant stress of living under Margaret's thumb. One evening, as we sat on the deck watching the sunset, Daniel turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about Margaret? He asked. I hesitated, then nodded. Sometimes, but not in the way I used to. I don't feel angry or scared anymore. I just feel sorry for her. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Sorry? After everything she put us through? I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Yeah. I mean, think about it. She's so obsessed with control that she can't even let people live their lives. That's not a happy existence. I don't think she's ever going to find real peace unless she lets go of all that. Daniel was silent for a moment, then nodded. You're right. I guess in a way, we're lucky. We got out. We found a place where we can be happy. She's still stuck in that same cycle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a sense of gratitude wash over me. We had faced adversity, but we had come out stronger on the other side. And while Margaret's actions had caused us pain, they had also taught us the importance of standing up for ourselves and choosing a life that truly made us happy. Epilogue. Moving forward. Years later, Daniel and I still live in Maplewood Hills, surrounded by neighbors who feel more like family. We've built a life filled with love, laughter, and the kind of freedom we always dreamed of. As for Margaret, we've heard through the grapevine that she's still the president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, still enforcing her rules with an iron fist. But her power no longer holds any sway over us. Sometimes, when I think back to our wedding day, I feel a twinge of sadness for what could have been. But then I look at Daniel, at the life we've built together, and I realize that the challenges we faced only made our bond stronger. In the end, we didn't just escape Margaret's tyranny. We found a way to thrive in spite of it. And that, I think, is the true measure of our victory. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.